Poets are generally thought of as otherworldly creatures, tucked into a rabbit hole, as it were, completely socially aloof, not wanting to interact with other people, and just writing poetry in the privacy of their homes. Now, nothing can be farther from the truth. As a poet, I can vouch for the fact that poets are as much social human beings like anyone else. Obviously, poets can be introvert, but that's like all of us. Anybody can be either an introvert or an extrovert, but generally speaking, poets benefit as much from socializing, talking to people, interacting with them, and sharing their work, performing their work on a public platform as anybody else. Of course, some of us are introverted, like I said, and some of us, especially those of us, who are very serious about sort of writing poetry from a getting published point of view and from a literary point of view, do not like to perform our works in public. But that's, as I said, a very subjective thing. Of course, performing your poetry in public wouldn't make you into a sensation, into a star overnight. But I would still say that as a poet, it's very important to perform your work, your poetry in public, and it has many advantages. Hi guys, this is Rati here. Welcome back to my channel. So in this video, I'm going to give you 5 reasons as to why you should perform your poetry in public. Reason number 1. Performing your poetry in public gives you a chance to socialize with other poets. Now guys, whenever you perform your poems at a poetry open mic or a poetry performance event, you're going to meet a lot of like-minded poets there, and you interact with those poets and poetry lovers, you listen to their poems, and it's generally sort of you get to build a poetic vibe, which, let's accept it, it's very difficult to get that poetic vibe, especially for us poets, in our day-to-day lives. So performing your poetry can be a great source of creativity and inspiration because, like I said, you get to socialize with, so many like-minded poets. And I can speak it from my personal experience. Whenever I return from a poetry event or a poetry performance, my head is generally buzzing with ideas and I'm in that kind of a poetic zone. So definitely perform. Even if you don't consider yourself a performer, don't leave any opportunities to perform your poetry in public, especially if you're an aspiring poet. Trust me, it will give you a lot of creativity and inspiration for writing poetry and, for just generally getting ideas for writing poetry. The second reason for performing your poetry in public is that poetry performance can improve your poetry writing skills. Now, this might seem like a bit far-fetched and exaggerated, but again, speaking from my personal experience, as a poet, it's true and I can vouch for it. When you attend a poetry event and perform your own poetry, right, there are other performers as well, and listening to those other poets gives you access to, new ideas and new themes which you might want to incorporate in your own poetry. Maybe a particular poet, has a style of writing poetry that's really appealing to you and you want to experiment with that style in your own poem. You also get a lot of feedback from the audience and fellow poets on your poetry. So you get new insights into your own poetry, Maybe somebody interpreted your poem in a light that you never, imagined your poem could mean something like this. And you go like, wow, I never thought, my poem could mean something like this as well. So performing your poetry at a public event, in hindsight can actually give you a lot of material and content to work on your poetry writing skills, to improve your poetry writing skills. Reason number 3 for performing your poetry in public, it motivates you to write more. Now that's an obvious thing. Whenever you have to read your poems at a poetry open mic event or a poetry performance, you obviously, need something new to read. You cannot read your old poems all the time. So it gives you that much needed motivation and inspiration to write new poems. Again, I'm speaking from my personal experience. When I was organizing a lot of poetry events through my poetry group Moon Viewers, Chand Ke Julahe, my writing was prolific. My poetry productivity had increased a lot because I was constantly, organizing new things, theme-based poetry open mics, and then I was myself excited about writing new stuff, something new I was writing almost every month. Especially theme-based poetry events are very popular these days, and themes are, a really good way of disciplining yourself to writing and being productive. Now let's accept it. We cannot wait for inspiration to strike all the time. That's the ideal scenario, obviously. But as poets, if you want to become a professional poet in the long term and get a poetry book published, then you cannot just wait for inspiration from heaven to strike all the time. So in that case, when that inspiration from heaven isn't striking, it just isn't coming at the right moment, a bit of push, a bit of motivation in the form of external poetry events where you have to go and read your poems. So you have a target to write new poems. It's a very, good way to inspire you to write more. Number 4, poetry performance can help you understand your audience better. Now, guys, when we are just writing poetry in the privacy of our homes, or maybe a better way to put it is that when poetry writing is like an intimate activity for us, where we are just immersed in books and in the act of poetic creation, we have no idea about who our audience is. We are pretty much writing whatever comes to our head, whatever we like writing, and hoping somebody on the earth will like this and somebody on the earth will read my poetry or read my book. But that's not the way it works. If you want to become a long-term poet professionally, if you want to get your poetry published somewhere down the line, you got to develop an idea of who your audience is, what kind of readership are you looking at. And poetry performance events really help you do that, because when you read your poetry, perform your poetry at a public event, then obviously, there's going to be some audience, and these audience members typically ask questions, interact with the poets, and even through their facial expressions and how they're reacting to your performance, you can figure out if they're liking your poetry performance or not. You can also watch, their reactions to other people's performance, other poets' performance, at whose performance they're liking the most. Now, obviously, this might sound a bit simplistic. I'm not trying to say that you change your poetry writing style according to the whims and fancies of the audience, or according to what the audience likes the most. But still, it's important to sort of gauge the interest of the audience at a performance event to see how your poetry ranks in terms of, people's interest, in terms of readership interest. So in that way, a poetry performance event, performing a poetry in front of people, gives you a fairly good idea, decent idea of your readership. Last but not the least, a bit of recognition never hurt. Now, obviously, as poets, our primary aim should be to improve our writing skills, and we should not let, praise and adulation get into our heads, but still a bit of recognition never hurts, especially if you're in the beginning stage, initial stages of poetry writing. Then if you have, perform your poetry somewhere and you get some praise from somebody, or you put your poetry performance video on YouTube or somewhere, and, somebody says a comment that, hey, your poem is interesting, or you recited it very well, your voice is amazing, your voice modulation is very good, then obviously, you get a kick out of it, and you get excited to be more productive as a poet. You get excited to work on your, craft as a poet. So like I said, poetry writing, doesn't work in those obvious and straightforward fashions that you just read your books, you lock yourself up and you write poetry. Poetry writing is very much of a social activity. You might not be with people when you're writing poetry, but the whole process of, getting ideas and inspiration for writing poetry is a very social dynamic and a public process. At least for some people, it can be. So I think you definitely need to perform your poetry in public, even if you don't want to become a professional, public performer, but it will definitely help you in your poetic journey. So guys, that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. And please don't forget to press the like button, and please do remember to subscribe to the channel to see more interesting episodes like these. Thank you so much for listening.